Hotel Lima Alpha.
Greetings, friends. As the cold of winter sets in and the nights grow so dark and long, it's not surprising if a feeling of dread sets in from time to time. After all, when you're in the dark, why wouldn't you feel all alone? Alone with your thoughts, with your wrongs, and the fear of not knowing whether you're being followed by a specter or just losing your mind. Tonight's tale is called Haunted! A bitter, stinging taunt, a burning sense of wrong and hatred, a moment of wild, mad passion, and 2 human lives forever hopelessly wrecked and blasted. How strange and unreal it all seems to be. Although I know that I must die tomorrow, although I can hear the sound of the hammer and the saw as they ply their ghastly task, yet even now I cannot bring myself to realize that it is not some hideous dream from which I may at any moment awake. But I know only too well that the vision which I see before me, by day and by night, is no dream, is no phantom. Would God that it were! I see myself and him standing together in the wild, on a craggy hillside. We were talking of her, and there is an evil smile about his cruel lips, as he tells me carelessly that I need not trouble to send her any more letters, that she has commissioned him to inform me that our engagement is at an end, and that she has promised to marry him on his return to England. I hear the sneering tone in his voice as he taunts me, when high words arise, with being a pauper and a beggar, and then a burning sense of all my wrongs seizes me, and a fierce thirst for revenge rushes through my blood. I see myself raise the pocket knife with which I had been idly pruning an oak sapling. I see myself raise it suddenly aloft, and in a fit of insane fury plunge it to the very hilt into his false heart. It was but the work of a moment when I was goaded and maddened to such a pitch by all the sense of my wrongs, that I cannot believe God will hold me altogether answerable for what I did. The words had hardly died upon those lying lips before he lay dead at my feet, the warm blood gushing and gurgling from the spot where the knife was still buried. And yet I felt no horror for what I had done. No feeling of remorse came over me, only a hideous consciousness that there a corpse lay, and must be got rid of in some way, because if it were so found everything would point to me as the murderer. A sudden terror, a wild panic possessed me. Although I knew there was none near, yet I felt I could not breathe, could not think, until I had hit it anywhere out of sight and out of mind. I seized it in my arms and staggered blindly on, hardly knowing what I sought, or whither I went. But fate favored me, for my eye fell upon a long, narrow crevice in the limestone rock, over which I was hastening. Panting and trembling with fear, I bent down and stuffed my burden through this opening, but it lay ghastly and bare before me, as though the very earth refused to receive the witness of my crime. With hands that shook with agitation, I seized a wedge of rock and forced it through the crevice as a covering, and saw, to my inexpressible belief, that the body had disappeared. So I hastily filled every part with stones and shingle that lay about, in order that no trace of my crime might remain. And then I stood up and thought about what I had done. God knows how little I ever dreamt that I should be a murderer. Only that morning I had read of the execution of some unhappy wretch, and had thought of him with horror and loathing, as of a foul thing between whom and myself there could be no kinship save that of our common humanity. And I now too was such as he. Yet I felt no remorse, no detestation of my crime, only a dull, dead, dreamy feeling of some hideous illusion which possessed me, and which I strove to arouse myself from in vain. I knew there was little to no fear of discovery, that none excepting myself was aware of his being in Germany, and that from his strange habits and uncertain movements it might be months before he was missed. I thought it best, however, to leave the immediate neighborhood, so that night I paid my bill at the hotel and took the train to Rochburg, a town some 10 miles distant. It was in vain that I tried to shake off the lethargy which oppressed me. All my thoughts were merged into one dull consciousness. As I looked at the faces of those around, they seemed to recede and withdraw in the distance, and even their voices had a weird, far-off sound. So strange and unreal did it all seem that I would repeat myself in a mechanical way. This is I, Richard Spaulding, and try to shake off the spell that bound me, but it was in vain. I saw the faces of people around, and answered when I was addressed, but they were the faces of dream phantoms, not of living men and women. One morning, the manager of the hotel asked me if I would like to make one in a party which was going to drive to the famous caverns of Touraine. I said that I should be pleased to do so, or rather, an automatic creature which moved and spoke in my name had said so, for the real self was still wrapped in the dreamlike torpor. I have very little recollection of the drive, but as I remember, our arrival at the mouth of the caverns, which I had heard were miles in extent, was the most wonderful in Europe. Our guide had marshaled us in single file, I being last, and having placed a lighted torch in the hand of every third person, he led us into the grotto. Even in my dazed and wildered condition, I was filled with wonder at what I saw. We passed through dark, icy caverns where gigantic stalactites and stalagmites writhed and twisted like huge reptiles around us. We crept bent double through slimy cavities and winding passages, where the chill water dripped monotonously around us, and then we emerged into an enormous cavern, so vast and lofty that the lurid light of our torches utterly failed to penetrate the unsearchable darkness that brooded around. The air, chill as the halls of death, seemed heavy with a mysterious blackness, and above us there swept a fierce wind that howled and rumbled, like far-off thunder in the hollow womb of night. Then, as we stood there full of shuddering awe, the wind lulled. We heard sweeping and rushing below the roar of mighty waters, and as the guide flung a torch into the gloom that encircled us, we found we stood on the edge of a vast abyss, at the bottom of which we could see an inky gleam of black waters rolling sullenly below. And around crept and writhed foul, slimy, crawling things that stole noiselessly away into the darkness, and above wheeled circled clouds of strange bat-like creatures, uttering unearthly cries of blind, impotent anger. What I have now to relate, I cannot hope will be believed. It will be regarded, I doubt not, as a delirious dream of a madman, the creation of an overwrought brain. But I know only too well that what I saw that fearful morning, I did veritably and indeed see. It was no illusion, no hallucination. Would to God that it had been. I have said that I felt no remorse for the crime that I had committed, no feeling of detestation or horror, nor had I in any way brooded or dwelt upon the memory of my guilt. Had it been so, I could then have well believed that what I saw had no real existence, but was the creation of a diseased brain. But no thought of my victim was in my mind at the time. I can hardly realize now that I could so readily dismiss the memory of what I had done, but such was the case, and hence it was that what I then beheld came upon me with so fearful a shock. I was the last of the party, and the others having moved on some little way ahead, when suddenly a strange fascination seized and held me spellbound, so that I could not move nor stir, but stood rooted upon the spot like one in a dream. I tried to call for help as I saw that I was being left behind, but all power of utterance seemed gone. And then dreadful horror came over me, an awful consciousness of some evil presence. Slowly and mechanically I turned around, compelled by a strange fascination. I tried to resist, but all willpower and self-control had left me. I was aware only of a bluish, misty, phosphorescent light, and then a ghastly terror that froze the very blood in my veins seized me. For suddenly I saw rise up out of the inky darkness of a cavern behind me the form of a man, the eyes wide distended and of a hideous red, fixed on mine with a look of hate, the mouth half closed, but with the teeth showing like the teeth of a wild beast before it makes its spring, and the left hand pointing to the wound in his chest, where I could see gleaming out, even in the darkness, the blade of a knife. It was but a moment, for even as I looked, the awful apparition died away into the gloom, but in that moment, to me it seemed years, I recognized the face of the man I had foully murdered. A wild, exultant cry of devilish triumph seemed to ring in my ears, whence coming I knew not, and then a darkness blacker and more hideous than the impenetrable night of that awful cavern seized me, and I knew no more. Tomorrow I die, and God knows with what terror I will shrink from the thought of that hour. And yet I doubt if the death which I so fear can be more awful than was the return to life and consciousness after that ghastly vision. At first I could recollect nothing, knew nothing. Only a death-cold numbness lay in my heart and brain and limbs. Slowly I opened my heavy eyelids to see if it were yet daytime, but everywhere around was an unearthly blackness that folded me about like an inky cloak. I strove to pierce the gloom, till my strained eyeballs seemed as though they might crack and burst, but there was nothing save endless impenetrable night. And then it came back to me, bit by bit. I was at Dover, at Calais, at Berlin, at Hartsburg. He was there. He who had been my curse and my ruin, my evil spirit all through life. We stood together again, together on that wild, craggy hillside. He spoke of her, showed me the letters that told of her treachery, told me lightly that it was he who had robbed me of her, as he robbed me of everything else. And then I saw it all again, the quarrel, the mad deed, the cavern, and, oh God, that ghastly, hideous vision. And I was alone, alone in the fearful abode of death, alone with my own evil conscience, and the recollection of that awful apparition. My one terror was lay there on the slimy ground, with foul-crawling things creeping over face and limbs, not daring move lest I should see the red light of those ghastly eyes, glaring down on me from the darkness. How long I remained thus, I do not know. It may have been hours, it may have been days. To me, it was but one long, unchanging, eternal night. I knew that I could not live long so, that even if my brain did not give way under the torture, I soon must die of terror. At last I forced myself by desperate effort and will to rise and stand, but I turned sick and giddy at the thought of the awful abyss upon which I might be standing, and into which one single step might at any moment plunge me. I knelt down again and crawled along on my hands and knees, feeling every inch of the ground as I went, until I came to the edge of the pit and heard the black torrent of the river roaring and hissing sullenly below. Once the wish to throw myself over and to so end my misery crossed my mind, but the thought of the unknown horrors which might be waiting for me in that hideous gulf made me shrink back again. And then I recollected that I had a small box of wax matches in my pocket, and pulled it out, and with eager trembling fingers opened it. There was only one left, but I felt that to see the light even for some seconds would be inexpressible relief. It would at least assure me that I still retained my sight, for I was haunted by an ever-recurring dread that I had lost it forever. I struck the match and glanced tremblingly around. Horrible as was the midnight blackness that enshrouded me, the momentary gleam was still more horrible. The darkness was all hidden, and there were no dim outlines or shadowy figures to terrify my imagination. As I looked around in the dim light of the taper, the limestone rocks and stalactites hung about me took form and shape and hideous beyond all description. Sheeted corpses and fleshless skeletons stretched white bony arms as if to seize me in their ghastly embraces. Strange beasts and reptiles seemed to glare from every side, and I beheld, or thought I beheld, red eyes of flame, which so burned into my very soul that I flung the tiny taper away and buried my hands in my face to shut out the awful vision. And then the wind arose and howled and shrieked in the vast abysses, and below me I heard the hollow rush and roar of the angry waters, leaping angrily against the slimy banks, as though impatient at being balked of their prey, so that I was seized with a sudden terror lest I might slip and fall into the watery hell, and I crawled back again with clammy limbs and parched lips. And ever in my mind there was the dread lest that awful vision should reappear, and ever I was rent and torn by the most terrible remorse that had ever racked a human soul. At last I fell into dream-haunted slumber. O God, what an awakening! What aroused me I knew not, but when I opened my eyes I saw a lurid light all around, and there, right in front of me, was that hideous vision again, the ghastly red eyes glaring down at me, the white teeth glittering like the teeth of a wild beast, and a hand still pointing at the wound in their chest, where the knife, my knife, was buried. And as I shrank back in horror and dread, I saw that it was no dream, no apparition or brain phantom, which was before me. It was the corpse of the man I had murdered, wet with the waters that had borne it from the crevice where I had thrust it to the cave prison where I lay. Yes, it was the corpse of the man I had murdered, come to bear witness against me. And then I heard a cry, "Good God, this is a murder!" And then behind me I saw standing, with white, horrified faces, the party guests of the hotel, whom the guide was taking over the caverns. I was too remorse-stricken and broken to deny my crime, nor would it have availed me much had I done so. Tomorrow I die, and I must face the great judge of all, to answer before him for my sins. But no hell torments can be more awful than the agony of those black hours, and shall they not be taken into account? So that's all we've got for tonight. I will be back tomorrow with another tale for you. But until then, good night, whatever you are.